Welcome back to Dead Reckoning, the Human Life Expectancy channel. You might expect that extending human life expectancy would be an ethically straightforward endeavor. Yet, as we gain the capability to live longer, there are core issues to address, such as, is it wrong to want to live longer? If people do live longer, can the world support the larger human population that will result? Will living longer place an increased burden on younger people or other species? How will we ensure that human life expectancy increases evenly and fairly across the globe? And will people resist life-extending technologies? These are the questions we'll explore in this video. So let's start out with the first one. Is it wrong to want to live longer? We certainly have a strong track record of wanting to live longer and realizing this dream. We've seen that human life expectancy has more than doubled around the globe in just the last 120 years, and we've reviewed multiple technologies that offer great promise in extending it further. But is living longer ethical? Well, yes, we're going to say it's absolutely ethical. Perhaps our strongest proof is that today, no 34-year-old is considered unethical because she's lived longer than the global life expectancy in 1900. Our central thesis that HLE will extend by at least 10 years in the next 20 years further suggests that this norm will continue to change. More rigorously, the ethical perspectives we forwarded in our last video also show that it will be highly ethical to live longer. Check out that video if you haven't seen it yet. Under the human rights and equality perspective, perhaps the foremost right is to prolong our lives as we're able. So you can hardly say it's unethical to live longer but support human rights. Every country around the world supports the individual's right to live as long as they're able and enshrines this into law. Also, to not support this right would be to violate the perspective that evolution and technology don't stop. It would be immoral to not allow our species to evolve to live longer. In fact, failing to leverage genetics and other scientific and medical advances to improve our health could even lead to the end of our species. Not allowing us to develop and choose a broader range of characteristics could make us less able to adapt to future conditions, such as perhaps a warmer Earth or higher levels of radiation in space or other factors. After all, as Leon Megginson said in 1963, it's not the strongest of species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that is most adaptable to change. The same perspectives show that it would be immoral not to use any viable tool to increase human life expectancy. Would anyone truly propose only to extend life to any age, say 50, but not beyond? Or to let people over 50 die when we have the ability to save them? As anti-aging gerontologist Aubrey de Grey argued in his 2005 TED Talk, quote, "If we do not pursue the option to extend life expectancy, if we fail to explore the possibility of curing aging, we are then condemning a full cohort of people to an untimely death, and that is immoral. It is not right for us to decide this for future generations." Oxford's Nick Bostrom adds that we must apply the reversal test. He said, "If you're going to argue that genetically engineering a person to live longer is bad, you'd have to articulate why engineering a person to live shorter is good, because in fact, that's in effect what you're doing." Let's move on to our second question. If people live longer, can the world support the larger human population that will result? In all likelihood, yes, it could. As we showed in our video, How Will Exponential Human Population Growth End?, the extension of human longevity has a smaller impact on population size than you might expect, and smaller than forecasted changes in fertility. And there are multiple technological advancements in food, energy, etc. that could likely allow us to handle this increase. So let's go to the third question. Will living longer place an increased burden on younger people and other species? First, it's not clear that living longer will create a net burden to the young. On one hand, in the last 120 years, human life expectancy has already doubled around the globe, causing an increased financial burden on young people who need to support older people in retirement. And in many countries, this is stressing healthcare and pension systems to the limit. On the other hand, as we saw in our video on curing aging, health span will likely increase with lifespan, and the latter years of one's working life are often the most productive. This longevity windfall is a net benefit to society, helping both the young and the old. In addition, people like Peter Diamandis and Michio Kaku have argued that we're heading toward an abundant future where technology provides us with much of what we need to live. So any increased burden might be more than offset by the amount of work done by machines, artificial intelligence, etc. Even if living longer does impose burdens on the young, what's to be done? It's the job of governments to help balance such potential generational wealth transfers and expropriations. Governments are responding in a number of ways, including extending the age of retirement and access to pensions. This is a far more palatable approach than saying we should not have doubled our life expectancy or should not do so going forward, or that older people's rights to survive is less important than younger people's rights to be financially unburdened, which is clearly absurd. Even if there were an increased burden on the young, that probably wouldn't prevent us from extending human life expectancy. As we've argued, it will be very difficult to stop this. People have the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which clearly includes actions to prolong life. Also, the living first perspective demonstrates that we've been very comfortable with the living putting their needs before those of subsequent generations. With respect to other species, if the human population increases, that could well harm other species that compete for resources such as land, food, water, and would increase the number of animals required to feed or serve humans. However, evoking the humans first perspective, we've not had much of an ethical issue with displacing, breeding, eating, and even causing the extinction of other species in the past, and it's not clear why extending human life expectancy should be a trigger for doing so now. So, the older person's right to survive will likely outweigh any negative implications for younger people and other species from an ethical perspective. But of course, under the imperative to responsibility perspective, we should increasingly be responsive to the needs of future generations and people and species that cannot represent themselves. So let's move on to the next question. How will we ensure human life expectancy increases evenly and fairly across the globe? The human equality perspective suggests that every human should have equal access to extending his or her life. This is probably impossible in practice, but warrants ongoing monitoring and efforts to bring us ever closer to it over time. Numerous factors could cause access to life-extending technologies to be unequal. They might be developed in one or only a few places around the globe, which are then likely to have prior or preferred access. The legal or regulatory limits might make them unavailable in some countries and regions. The costs of undertaking new technological and medical advances might make them more available to the wealthy than the poor. So, for example, genetic engineering to cure sickle cell anemia currently costs more than $1 million. It would be far more economical to treat embryos with this condition, but the regulations and financing required to do this are not worked out yet. In the meantime, such treatments may only be available to the wealthy. However, as we've shown, some of the technologies that could bring about the largest increases in human life expectancy are not very expensive. For example, there are now $100 CRISPR kits available over the internet. Now note that these kits do not currently include any way to extend your life, but they show that gene editing can in theory be done very inexpensively. The vast majority of people around the world today could afford such a procedure. In the future, genetic engineering is likely to become even more affordable as income is likely to continue to increase while the cost of genetic engineering continues to fall. Also, since the present value of savings from avoided medical costs is much higher than the cost of genetic and epigenetic tests, or as the insurance industry likes to say, they have positive protective value, that nations will likely find it to their advantage to provide genetic testing and related therapies. Resolving these issues and providing equal access is critical. Failure to do so could result in a much higher risk of conflict between the haves and the have-nots of life-extending technologies. And this could materially increase resistance to new technologies that reduce the adoption rate, ultimately costing many lives. As a practical matter, unless global politics advances dramatically, different countries and regions will likely have different approaches to sharing the benefits of life-extending technologies throughout their societies. We suspect that some technologies will be provided by the government in some countries, subsidized by insurance in others, and available only to the wealthy in others still. Let's move on to our final question. Will some people resist life-extending technologies? We think that they will. So let's explore why and what can be done about it. Throughout history, even great advancements in health and science have been resisted, costing us many millions of lives. Most great life-extending technologies, including vaccines, pasteurization, and antibiotics, were all initially resisted and called unnatural and immoral, So what's that about? First, there is a general resistance to new technologies of all types. For example, the Luddites resisting the cotton gin. But given the recent levels of resistance and political obstruction to COVID vaccines in the US and elsewhere, it's reasonable to expect resistance to other clearly beneficial life-extending technologies. Of course, there will also always be some individuals saying that they don't want to live longer. This is sometimes driven by a perception that they will live in ill health. For example, check out this cartoon from The New Yorker saying, "See, the problem with doing things to live longer is that all those extra years come at the end, when you're older." Fortunately, as we've shown, the strong likelihood is that health span will continue to increase with lifespan. And young people often underestimate their desire to live as they get older. Actor Andy Rooney famously noted that, quote, "Death is a distant rumor to the young." And when she was 16, a childhood friend of ours once swore to us that she did not want to live past the age of 35. When we reminded her of this on her 36th birthday, she quickly responded, "I've changed my mind." And now she's quite happily over 60 years old. Most directly, suicide and self-harm accounts for about 1.3% of global deaths, but the rate fell 29% between 2000 and 2019 due to better meds, crisis lines, and other good efforts. So, while it will not go away, there's reason to hope that it may become less of a problem. However, the bulk of resistance to life-extending technologies will likely come from people who perceive that the technologies violate the way of things or religious and other narratives that we've always told ourselves. Unique among animals, we humans have always struggled with our consciousness of our own mortality. The notion that we and everyone we know and love will turn to dust is a deeply unnerving reality to bear. As philosopher and author Sam Keen wrote, quote, "The basic motivation for human behavior is our biological need to control our basic anxiety to deny the terror of death." Accordingly, since the beginning of time, our religions, cultures, and literature have all helped us to avoid facing our mortality. We've told ourselves 3 immortality narratives to calm ourselves and allow us to go on with our lives. These counterfactual narratives either deny the reality of our mortality or absolve us of any guilt for the outcomes. The first narrative is that we will live forever. Immortality is often said to be one of the promises of deities to human beings who show goodness or follow their divine laws. The second and even more common narrative is that we'll be reincarnated. Perhaps the central faith in many religions is the belief that we will be resurrected or reincarnated if we follow certain religious commandments or practices. As philosopher Ernest Becker noted, quote, "Christianity took creature consciousness, the thing man most wanted to deny, and made it the very condition for his cosmic heroism." The third narrative is that our lives are destined. The idea is that some deity has predestined our lives and there's nothing we can do about it. While this narrative doesn't promise immortality, it handily absolves us from any responsibility for what happens and any need to worry about death. Because these narratives relieve us of fear and responsibility for death, our literature is rife with stories that trying to cheat death turns out badly. The legend of King Gilgamesh of Uruk, who sought immortality in vain, is the oldest surviving literary work. In Greek mythology, when Eos asked her father Zeus to make her lover Tithonus immortal, she forgot to ask that he be granted eternal youth. Zeus granted her wish, and she watched Tithonus get ever older and weaker in eternity. In 1726, Jonathan Swift wrote Gulliver's Travels, which imagined a race of struldbrugs, which are born immortal but age normally, so live in continuously worsening health. In 1817, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, which clearly did not have a happy ending. In 1890, Oscar Wilde wrote the novel Dorian Gray, where the protagonist stayed young while his painted visage turned old. In 1897, Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, where living forever comes at a very, very high price. Louis Borges wrote a short story called The Immortal in 1949 about a society of immortals that find out that living forever removes the motivation for wanting to do anything. In Isaac Asimov's 1976 novel, The Bicentennial Man, the protagonist is a robot who can live forever by repairing himself whenever necessary. However, he wants to be human. He ultimately designs a prosthetic brain that will decay quickly, ensuring that he will die like any other human, rather than live forever as a robot. In the 1996 film Star Trek: First Contact, the Queen of the Borgs, cybernetic organisms linked to a hive mind called the Collective, enslaves billions so that she might live forever. And, spoiler alert, she ends up dying a spectacular death. These and other stories have helped us to deny our mortality in the past. However, now the reality is that we have already doubled HLE in the last 120 years and are poised to make accelerated progress going forward. It's high time that we abandon these outdated narratives. Together, these three immortality narratives have created a common fatalistic bias toward dying that is literally killing us. As reassuring as they might be, there is no evidence that these narratives are true, and believing in them causes much harm to ourselves and our society. The fact is that no one has been proven to live longer than Jean Calment, who died in 1997 at the age of 122 years. There's also no evidence that things that might be regarded as a soul live on after our death, and there is irrefutable evidence that elements of what would often be regarded as our soul, things like intelligence, personality, character, and memory, change or disappear with diseases, for example Alzheimer's, or injuries to the brain even while we're still alive. Assuming that these capabilities would reemerge after death when they had already ceased to exist in the living is a tall order indeed. So, what's the harm in believing in reassuring falsehoods about our mortality? Of course, we should all avoid perseverating on negative things about which we have no control, but that's just the point. Today we're gaining unprecedented control over our individual and collective death, and failing to exercise it would be a crime of the first order. These narratives are problematic for society in general, especially if our objective is to increase HLE. If you believe that your future is predetermined, or that you'll live forever or be reincarnated, why bother trying to improve things or extend human life expectancy? Because these beliefs are so opposed to the dead reckoning objective of helping as many people as possible to live as long as possible, as soon as possible, we must acknowledge this common cultural bias toward death and note that these narratives can cause harm as well as good. The fact that these narratives are currently broadly held does not mean that they could not and should not be changed. They promote the dangerous misconception that facts, even the most fundamental ones about our death, are subjective and that truth does not matter. This sets a bad precedent for denying other inconvenient truths to our detriment. More on this in our videos on advancing the evolution of ideas. Also, believing that we will be rewarded in the future for suffering current conditions can remove the impetus for constructive change. Knowing this, people in positions of power throughout the ages have leveraged these narratives to entrench themselves and exploit the powerless. The immortality narratives also prevent us from recognizing that the awareness of our mortality has always been a powerful driver of human accomplishment, and that our highly improbable existence and inevitable death can make the miracle of our lives sparkle even more brightly. Steve Jobs said this very well in his 2005 Stanford University graduation commencement address when he himself was battling cancer. He said, quote, "Death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Right now, the new is you, but someday, not too long from now, you will gradually become old and be cleared away. Your time is limited, so don't waste it." Author Stephen Cove also put it well in his book, Immortality. He wrote, quote, "We can barely begin to imagine the good fortune that led to the development first of life, and then of animals and mammals and humans and your family, and finally, you." Perhaps the worst impact of these immortality narratives would be for them to cause us to stop pursuing the extension of HLE. It'd be ironic and tragic if these stories we told ourselves to feel better about the grim reality of our mortality caused us to not postpone death as we're able. As the ancient Greeks said, the gods help those that help themselves. We should also question who it is that says we should die when our time has come. Ultimately, we're the ones telling ourselves these narratives, and we should tell ourselves otherwise. We can tell ourselves a new narrative, one that relishes the ephemeral beauty of our individual and collective existence and places us appropriately among all creatures in doing so. One that says that our death is not determined by fate or any deity, but instead by our own actions, behaviors, and our ever-expanding capabilities. As Dylan Thomas famously wrote, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage, rage against the dying of the light." This new narrative is better for our psyches, for our longevity, and better for our survival as a species. In the vein of great doctors and inventors throughout history, let's boldly face our mortality and explore the things that kill us, including aging itself, and what we can do about them. We must help people to recognize that increasing numbers of deaths are not inevitable and that something can and should be done. This is one of the primary objectives of the Dead Reckoning videos. The Dead Reckoning framework also helps us to understand the magnitudes of both the positive and the negative sides of new technologies. So, in our next two videos, we'll apply our 7 ethical perspectives to using IVF and PGD to revolutionize human reproduction and to genetic engineering. In the meantime, please hit the like button below, subscribe to the Human Life Expectancy channel to make sure you don't miss our next videos, and post comments for the topics you'd like to have us cover. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, as we say at Human Life Expectancy Inc., Hi Hua! Do what you can to help yourself and help us all to live longer.